Unbeknownst to many, American men of color experienced many forms of racial injustices throughout the duration of the Vietnam War that took place from 1955 to 1975. United States Defense Secretary Robert McNamara implemented Project 100,000, also known as McNamara's Morons or Misfits, which lowered military recruiting standards to keep and accept soldiers with lower mental or medical capacity than others in order to fulfill necessary military quota. According to the article, as The Five Bloods hits Netflix, Black Vietnam veteran recall the real injustices they faced during and after the war. Project 100,000, quote, pulled hundreds of thousands of poor men into war, 40% of them being African American. By the following year, black soldiers made up 16.3% of those drafted and 23% of Vietnam combat troops, despite accounting for roughly only 11% of the civilian population. Therefore, men of color were both disproportionately drafted and sent to frontline combat in a more frequent fashion. On top of this, men of color were also less likely to receive military promotions and were jailed and disciplined at proportionally higher rates in comparison to whites. Soldiers serving in the U.S. military must abide by the Uniform Code of Military Justice, or UCMJ for short, which is federal law. The UCMJ has some overlap with the Bill of Rights, but it has its limitations, such as the fact that soldiers do not have the right to freedom of speech. Therefore, being accused of a crime in the military is different than being accused as a civilian, as you are not governed by the same law. Military conviction requires a trial by court-martial, which is essentially a military judge, and court-martials typically assign harsher punishments for even small offenses like refusing to get a haircut or smoking marijuana, which was a common practice for soldiers in Vietnam. The National Institute of Military Justice states, quote, the overall conviction rate by military court-martial is 82%. This number essentially guarantees that if a soldier is accused of a crime, regardless of whether or not they are guilty, that 4 out of the 5 times they will be convicted of that crime. When one takes this statistic into mind and accounts for the fact that the Vietnam War occurred during much of the civil rights era in America, and that both racism and segregation were commonly practiced during this time, it can be easily inferred that many convictions for American soldiers of color were racially motivated and unjust. And this can be exemplified with the Long Binh military prison, as it held roughly 34,000 prisoners and yet had an incarceration rate for African American men that is estimated to be over 50%. When soldiers were put on frontline combat in Vietnam, they fought a brutal guerrilla warfare enemy in that of the Vietnamese communists, also known as the Viet Cong. However, many soldiers of color had another enemy, and that was their allies. After the 1968 assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., many white soldiers celebrated by raising Confederate flags in Da Nang and performed cross-lightings in Cam Ranh Bay. Cross-lightings are an intimidation practice and a common practice of the notorious white supremacy and terrorist group that is known as the Ku Klux Klan or KKK. Many soldiers of war were unfairly and involuntarily drafted into a war with a merciless enemy, where many of these allied soldiers around them supported an illegitimate faction that had seceded from their own country over 100 years before, which caused mass suffering of our nation and millions to die, but also promotes ideals like slavery, segregation, racial hatred, and white supremacy. Because of these factors, soldiers of color were typically outcast from other soldiers when they were given time off duty. Many of them began to spend their free time in color-accepting areas within Saigon, which is the capital of Vietnam, hence why these areas became known as Soulsvilles. When U.S. soldiers finish their duty to serve, there is a process that occurs called military discharge. This government document is called a Department of Defense Form 214, also known as a DD-214. There are 3 types of military discharges when soldiers leave the military: honorable, general, and dishonorable discharges. Honorable and general discharges are the normal kinds of discharges we bear in mind. However, dishonorable discharges are bad, as although technically getting a dishonorable discharge does not mean you are a convicted felon, many states treat it as such. That is, an individual that is out of jail after serving time when guilty of a felony crime has about the same amount of rights as a soldier that had a dishonorable discharge. What is generally not known in society is when a soldier gets a dishonorable discharge, they forfeit their rights to own firearms, they can no longer vote, and become ineligible to receive government benefits such as assistance from the Department of Veteran Affairs, burial benefits, life insurance money for remaining family members, and this is comparably similar to having a criminal record when searching for employment. Moreover, when these soldiers of color returned home permanently disfigured and damaged from the horrors of war, they found themselves hopeless, as the Department of Veterans Affairs illegally denied care for many African American veterans of Vietnam. The men who were able to receive help were studied by doctors, and now there is significant medical evidence pointing to the fact that African Americans were more likely to have developed post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, in comparison to white veterans in Vietnam. Many men of color were forced to fight in the Vietnam War for a country that left them permanently disfigured or dead, and treated many of whom were returned as if they were criminals and deserved nothing. Surviving as a veteran of color from the Vietnam War is similar in today's world to being dishonorably discharged or convicted of a felony. One of the final factors to consider is the fact of income inequality that existed particularly during the era of the Vietnam War. Countless young men of color who had draft age could not afford the fees for college. Therefore, they were unable to obtain a valuable student deferment of military service, since attending college was not affordable. Evading a military draft was not an option, as doing this can result in imprisonment of up to 5 years. These biased laws essentially allowed rich men to pay tuition in order to dodge a draft, which was highly discriminatory, as most rich men in this era of America were white. This resulted in a disproportionate amount of men of color being unable to attend college during the Vietnam era. Although this also affected young white poor men from the American Midwest, the typical college exceptions that would apply to them for other reasons were not available to these young colored men. Multiple famous songs were created in creative protest, taking shots at the inequalities and prejudice faced due to the Vietnam War. One such example is a song called Fortunate Son by the band Creedence Clearwater Survival, which exposes how the wealthy and powerful men of America made sure their sons avoided the draft for the war in Vietnam, but the bandmates in the song were not the fortunate sons to have this luxury. When looked at as a whole, all of these above items were essential factors in social injustice that resulted in a huge proportion of men of color that were forced into military service in the Vietnam era, the wounds of which have never been truly forgotten or healed.